It is a truth often whispered in the velvet-lined corridors of Mayfair, but never spoken aloud, that a duke's duty is the death of his soul. They say the ocean is a vast graveyard of secrets, but for Caroline it was the only thing wide enough to hold her grief. When the man she loved, the man who had promised her a lifetime of English roses, handed her a bank draft and a ticket to a New York-bound steamer, he didn't just break her heart. He ignited a fire that would burn across 2 continents. This is a story of a love betrayed by duty, a mother's iron will, and the echoes of a secret that even the Atlantic could not drown. If this tale of high-stakes scandal and the yearning for a lost home touches your heart, please subscribe and join our community of story seekers. I would love to hear in the comments, do you believe a man can truly earn forgiveness after such a betrayal? Chapter 1. The Ash and the Iron. The London fog was an intrusive thing, a grey, damp ghost that seeped through the heavy stone walls of Rothwell House, chilling everything it touched. But to Caroline, the coldness inside the Duke's study was far more lethal. Jonathan, His Grace, the 12th Duke of Rothwell, stood by the window, his back a rigid line of impeccable tailoring. He did not look at her. He hadn't looked at her for 3 days, not since his mother, the Dowager Duchess, had concluded their private audience. "The carriage is waiting, Caroline," he said. His voice was a flat, dead thing. It sounded nothing like the voice that had whispered her name in the heat of the dark, promising her that her American liveliness was the only thing keeping him from suffocating under the weight of his crown.
"You are truly doing this," Caroline said, her own voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain as iron-willed as the women of her New England lineage. "You are putting me on a ship like a piece of unwanted luggage, because your mother thinks my accent is too loud for the House of Lords." Jonathan finally turned. His face was a mask of aristocratic marble, though his eyes, those deep, storm-grey eyes that had once looked at her with such hunger, flickered with a momentary, jagged pain. "It is not merely the accent, and you know it. The political climate is delicate. A duke must marry where he can do the most good for the line. My mother has made it clear that a union with an American merchant's daughter will bankrupt my influence before I even take my seat. I am a companion, Jonathan. I was your wife in everything but a legal chapel," she whispered, her hand instinctively fluttering to her stomach. The secret there was only 6 weeks old, a tiny, flickering heartbeat she had planned to tell him about over tea that morning. Now the news felt like a leaden weight. If she told him now, would he keep her? And if he kept her only out of obligation, would that not be a slower, more agonizing death? "You were a beautiful distraction, Caroline," he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He crossed the room and placed an envelope on the mahogany desk. "There is a draft here. It is more than generous. It will see you settled in New York. You need never want for anything." Caroline looked at the envelope. To him, it was a solution. To her, it was the price of her silence and her disappearance.
"I don't want your money, Jonathan," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low vibrato. "I want the man who promised me he didn't care about the line, but I see he doesn't exist. He was just a ghost I conjured because I was lonely in this cold, grey country." She didn't take the envelope. She turned on her heel, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards like a viper. She walked out of Rothwell House with her head held high, the salt of her unshed tears stinging her throat. The voyage across the Atlantic was a blur of grey waves and violent morning sickness. While the other passengers in first class grumbled about the salt spray, Caroline sat in her cabin, her hand pressed to her womb, watching the horizon. Every mile that separated her from England felt like a stitch being ripped out of her skin. By the time the ship pulled into the New York harbor, the skyline of Manhattan, jagged, busy, and unapologetically loud, greeted her. It was a city of strikers and dreamers, a place where no one cared about the 12th Duke of Rothwell. She checked into a modest hotel under her maiden name. She looked at the check Jonathan had given her, a small fortune. With a grim set to her jaw, she tore it into a dozen pieces and watched them flutter into the wastebasket. "We don't need his charity, little one," she whispered to the empty room. "We will build our own kingdom." And she did.
3 years passed. The Inconvenient American became the formidable mistress of a boarding house in Gramercy Park. It wasn't a place for the destitute. It was a sanctuary for the refined but weary, scholars, disgraced poets, and wealthy travellers who preferred discretion over the gilded gaudiness of the Waldorf. Caroline ran it with the precision of a duchess and the wit of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and decided she didn't like the view. Her son, Henry, was the light of the house. He had his mother's golden spirit and his father's eyes, that piercing storm-grey gaze that seemed to see through every lie. Henry knew nothing of dukes or titles. He knew the smell of fresh linen, the taste of the baker's peppermint drops, and the stories his mother told him of a sad man who lived in a castle far away and had forgotten how to laugh. Caroline thought she was safe. She thought the ocean was wide enough. But one Tuesday in October, as the amber leaves of Gramercy Park danced against the cobblestones, a carriage pulled up to the front door. It wasn't a New York hackney. It was sleek, black, and bore no crest, yet it practically hummed with the arrogance of the British peerage. Caroline was at her leisure in the front hall when the bell rang. She smoothed her dark blue wool dress, tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and opened the door. The air left her lungs in a painful rush. There, standing on her doorstep, framed by the frantic energy of a New York afternoon, was Jonathan. He looked thinner, his face etched with lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago. He looked like a man who had spent 3 years breathing air that didn't sustain him.
"Caroline," he breathed, his voice cracking. She didn't move. She didn't faint. She simply gripped the edge of the door until her knuckles turned white. "I believe you have the wrong address, Your Grace," she said, her voice as cold as the London fog. "There are no distractions for you here." But before he could speak, a small, thundering set of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Henry burst into the foyer, clutching a small wooden boat. He stopped just behind Caroline, peering around her skirts at the tall, imposing stranger. Henry looked up, his grey eyes meeting the identical grey eyes of the man in the doorway. "Mama," the boy whispered, his voice filled with a strange, childish wonder. "Is this the sad man from the letters? Did he finally find his way out of the castle?" Jonathan felt the world tilt. He looked from the woman who had haunted his every waking thought to the boy who was undeniably, hauntingly, his own reflection. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Caroline had ever heard. Chapter 2. The Ledger of Broken Promises. The silence in the narrow hallway of the boarding house was not the polite, empty silence of a London drawing room. It was thick and heavy, vibrating with the ghost of 1,000 things left unsaid. Jonathan remained frozen on the threshold, his gaze anchored to the boy who stood clutching a wooden boat, as if it were a holy relic. "Henry, darling," Caroline said, her voice sounding as though it were coming from a great distance. She placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly against the soft cotton of his shirt. "Go to the kitchen. Mrs. Higgins has just pulled the ginger snaps from the oven. Tell her you are to have 2, and not a crumb more." Henry looked from his mother to the tall stranger, his brow furrowing in a way that was so excruciatingly familiar to Jonathan that it felt like a physical blow to his ribs. "Is he staying, Mama, the sad man?" "Only for a moment," Caroline replied, her eyes never leaving Jonathan's pale face. "Go now." The boy scurried away, his boots clicking rhythmically on the polished wood. As the kitchen door swung shut, the warmth seemed to drain from the foyer. Caroline turned back to the Duke, her expression hardening into a mask of exquisite, lethal composure. "You have seen him," she said. "Now you may leave. My son has a busy schedule of being happy, and I find your presence an unnecessary complication to his afternoon." "My son," Jonathan whispered, the words sounding foreign in his throat. "Caroline, why? Why would you not tell me?"
Because you had already told me everything I needed to know, she snapped, stepping back to allow him entrance, if only to close the door against the prying eyes of the street. She led him into her private parlour, a room filled with sunlight, the scent of dried lavender, and the comfortable clutter of a life lived for oneself. You told me that your line was more important than my love. You told me that an American wife was a liability. What would a child have been to you then, Jonathan? An even greater inconvenience, a more expensive line in your ledger of duties. Jonathan paced the small room, looking like a caged lion in a space meant for house cats. His presence seemed to shrink the walls.
You think I wanted to send you away. You think I enjoyed watching that ship disappear into the horizon. I did it to save you from the ruin that was coming. The estate was failing, Caroline. The roofs were falling in on the tenant cottages. The debts were mounting from my father's excesses. My mother showed me the accounts. I was told that unless I married an heiress, someone with a pedigree and a dowry that could satisfy the banks, every soul on Rothwell Land would be in the poorhouse within a year. He stopped, his eyes pleading for her to understand the noble weight he had carried. I sacrificed my heart to save my people. I thought I was being the man you expected me to be, a leader, a duke. Caroline watched him for a long moment, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across her lips. It was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 3 years sharpening her wits against the whetstone of reality. "Oh, Jonathan," she breathed, walking over to a small, locked secretaire. "You always were so terribly easy to manage. You were so busy being His Grace that you forgot how to be a man who asks questions." She pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger and tossed it onto the low table between them. It landed with a heavy thud. "What is this?" he asked. "While you were playing the martyr in your drafty castle, I was working," she said. "I didn't just build this house with my hands, Jonathan. I built it with my mind. I have spent 3 years corresponding with solicitors in London, using the names of my boarders to mask my inquiries. I wanted to know exactly how much I was worth in the eyes of the 12th Duke of Rothwell."
Jonathan opened the ledger. His eyes scanned the pages, meticulous records, copies of bank statements, and letters bearing the seal of his own family's legal firm. The bankruptcy was a fiction, Caroline said, her voice dropping to a low, cold hum. The ruin of the Rothwell estate was a shadow play staged by your mother and your solicitors. They didn't want an American duchess, and they knew that if they appealed to your sense of duty, you would break your own heart to do the right thing. Your mother shifted funds into offshore holdings to make the ledgers look bled dry. The moment I was gone, and you were safely engaged to that icy Lady Honoria, the miraculous recovery of the Rothwell fortune began. Jonathan's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. He gripped the edges of the ledger until the paper crinkled. "No, she wouldn't. She is my mother. She is a woman who cares about the color of a bloodline more than the beat of a heart," Caroline counted. She stepped closer, her anger finally breaking through the ice. "You threw me away for a lie, Jonathan. You sent your pregnant wife across an ocean for a debt that didn't exist. You traded your son's first steps and his first words for a crown that was never in danger of falling." The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He looked around the room, at the small wooden boat Henry had dropped, at the warmth of the heart, at the woman who had grown so much stronger in his absence. He had lived a hollow life of duty, sleeping in cold rooms and making speeches to men he despised, all to save a kingdom that didn't need saving. He had won his duty, and in doing so, he had lost everything that mattered.
"I have been a fool," he whispered, his legs finally giving way as he sank into a chair. "No," Caroline corrected, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and fire. "You were a duke, and in this house, Jonathan, that is the most useless thing a man can be." Chapter 3. The Renunciation of the Crown. The New York winter was not the soft grey veil of London. It was a jagged blade of ice that whistled through the narrow alleys and rattled the window panes of the Gramercy Park boarding house. For Jonathan, who had spent his life wrapped in the heavy velvet of tradition and a thick stone of Rothwell Castle, the cold felt personal. It was as if the city itself were trying to scour the aristocracy from his bones. In the weeks following the revelation of his mother's treachery, Jonathan had lived in a nearby hotel, appearing at Caroline's door every morning like a persistent ghost. He didn't come with demands of the Duke. He came with books for Henry and flowers that wilted in the freezing wind. But the weight of the betrayal, the crushing guilt of the years lost, and the relentless New York sleet finally took their toll. He collapsed on the threshold of the boarding house one Tuesday evening, his breath coming in ragged, wet rattles. Caroline found him there, his fine wool coat soaked through, his face flushed with a fever that burned hotter than any hearth. Against her better judgment, against the wall of ice she had built around her heart, she brought him in. She did not send him to a hospital. She put him in the small, warm guest room at the back of the house, the room closest to her own.
The days that followed were a blur of steam, eucalyptus, and the terrifying sound of a man drowning on dry land. Jonathan's pneumonia was a brutal, egalitarian master. It stripped him of his dignity, his title, and his strength. In the delirium of the fever, he didn't speak of estates or peerages. He didn't call for the Duchess. "Carrie," he would moan, his hands clawing at the air until she caught them. "Carrie, please, the ship is too fast. I can't reach the dock." Caroline sat by his bed, pressing cool cloths to his forehead. She watched the man who had once held the power of life and death over 1,000 tenants, reduced to a shivering soul begging for a second chance. She saw the scars on his spirit that she hadn't noticed in the dim light of London, the exhaustion of a man who had tried to carry a kingdom on his shoulders, only to find it was a hollow prop. "I'm here, Jonathan," she whispered, her voice finally breaking. "I'm here." One night, as the fever broke and the room was silent save for the ticking of the clock, Jonathan opened his eyes. They were clear for the first time in a week. He looked at Caroline, who was slumped in a chair, her hair coming loose from its pins. "I've sent the letter," he croaked, his voice a mere shadow. "What letter?" "To London, to my brother," Jonathan said, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "I have formally abdicated the dukedom. The titles, the land, the duty, it all belongs to Edward now. He always liked the castle more than I did anyway." Caroline froze. "You did what? Jonathan, that is your birthright."
"No," he said, reaching out to take her hand. His grip was weak, but his gaze was steady. "My birthright was a prison built on my mother's lies. I don't want to be his grace anymore, Caroline. I want to be the man who earns your breakfast. I want to be the man who teaches Henry how to sail a real boat in the harbour. I want to be just Jonathan, if you'll have me." He didn't return to England. During his recovery, he used his knowledge of international law and shipping to become a consultant for the merchants of the New York docks. He traded his signet ring for a fountain pen and his carriage for a pair of sturdy walking boots. He courted Caroline with the patience of a man who knew he had a lifetime of penance to pay. He took Henry to the piers, showing him the great iron-hulled ships, and for the first time, the sad man began to laugh. The wedding was held on a crisp spring morning in a small red brick church in Lower Manhattan. There were no coronets, no bishops in silk robes, and no dowager duchess glaring from the front pew. There was only the smell of fresh rain and the sound of a small boy giggling as he dropped the ring. As they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the New York sun caught the gold of Caroline's simple band. Jonathan looked at his wife, truly his wife now, and then down at the boy who was pulling at his sleeve. "Father?" Henry asked, testing the word as if it were a new toy. "Can we go to the harbour now? You promised to show me the big sails." Jonathan picked the boy up, swinging him onto his shoulder. The weight was heavy, but for the first time in his life, it was a weight he carried with joy. "Yes, Henry," Jonathan said, looking at Caroline with a love that had survived the fire and the frost. "Let's go see the world. It's much bigger than a castle." In the end, it was not the gold of a crown that defined him, but the gold of a morning sun over a new city. Jonathan had travelled across an ocean to find what he had thrown away, only to realize that a title is a cold companion compared to the warmth of a hand held in the dark. They built their legacy not in the crumbling stones of the old world, but in the bustling, breathing heart of the new. And every time Henry called him father, the echoes of the sad man faded a little more, replaced by the quiet, enduring strength of a man who had finally found his way home.